The salt air in Blackwood Cove felt heavier than it did a decade ago, as if the atmosphere were saturated with secrets the residents refused to voice. For Elena, the town was a graveyard of memories, its gray boardwalk serving as a constant reminder of the sister she lost. It had been 10 years since Sarah vanished, a bright girl swallowed by the shadows of the coastal woods. To the locals, the Sarah incident was a tragic footnote, a closed chapter best left undisturbed. But to Elena, it was an open wound. She lived in the silence of her family home, a house that had become a mausoleum after her mother passed away, leaving Elena alone with a father who spoke in sighs. The dilapidated houses leaned against one another like tired old men, their windows staring at the churning and merciless gray sea that seemed to swallow everything. One rainy Tuesday, while clearing out her late mother's study, Elena's fingers brushed against a leather-bound poetry book. It felt wrong, too light. When she pulled it from the shelf, the cover revealed a cavity carved into the pages. Nestled inside was an old, undeveloped roll of film. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. Why would her now-deceased mother hide this? Why keep it secret from the police and Elena? The weight of the canister felt like lead in her palm, a piece of the past demanding to be seen. It was as if her mother had left a breadcrumb from beyond the grave, a final confession she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to touch the small plastic cylinder. Elena drove to a specialist whose hands were stained with chemical silver. He returned later. His expression shifted to profound unease. He handed her a single, grainy photograph. It was Sarah. She was standing at the edge of the woods, where the ancient pines met the sea. But this wasn't the Sarah Elena remembered. In this image, Sarah looked paralyzed by a primal, soul-deep terror. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something just beyond the camera's lens, her mouth caught in a silent, jagged gasp. It was the last image of a life about to be extinguished, captured in a moment of pure, unadulterated fear. The trees seemed to lean in toward the girl, whispering of the darkness to come, their branches casting skeletal shadows across her pale, trembling face. Elena studied the photo under her desk lamp. It was then that she saw it, a tiny glint of light trapped within Sarah's left eye. Leaning in, Elena's breath hitched. Reflected in the pupil was a figure holding an antique silver compass, its lid engraved with a swirling crest of a hawk. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a candid shot, it was a record of her sister's final moments, captured by the person she was running from. Her mother had known this. She had kept this evidence hidden, allowing the trail to go cold, while Elena spent years screaming into the void. The grief felt like a betrayal. Why protect a monster when her own child was lost to the dark? 2 days later, a routine errand took Elena to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, her father's oldest friend, was out of the room. As Elena waited, her eyes wandered to his open desk drawer. There, resting atop a stack of files, was the exact same silver compass, the hawk crest gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elena's blood turned to ice as she realized the man who had promised to find Sarah had been holding the evidence of her terror all along. The very man she trusted was the silhouette in the photograph, and the nightmare was only just beginning to reveal its true face in the flickering light of the office. Elena slipped out of the station, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silver hawk on that compass burned into her retinas, a brand of betrayal. Miller, the man who had sat at their dinner table every Christmas, the man who had patted her head and promised justice, was the one Sarah had seen in her final moments. She couldn't go to the police. Miller was the law in this town. She needed someone the town had discarded, someone whose voice had been silenced by the same forces now closing in on her. Marcus lived in a cramped, salt-stained apartment above a bait shop, his walls plastered with old newspaper clippings that whispered of corruption and unsolved disappearances. He was a shadow of his former self, smelling of stale coffee and bitterness, but his mind remained sharp. He looked at the photograph Elena placed on his cluttered table, his eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. Marcus didn't look at Sarah's face. He looked at the mechanics of the image. He pointed to the shallow depth of field and the specific angle of the lens. This wasn't a sniper shot or a hidden surveillance image. The photographer was standing barely 5 feet away. Look at her eyes, Elena. She's terrified, yes, but she's also paralyzed. You don't stand still for a stranger like that. This was taken by someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to let get close before the mask finally slipped. The weight of the implication settled in the room, heavier than the coastal fog. It wasn't just Miller watching from the shadows. It was the circle of trust that had surrounded Sarah her entire life. The warning signs began the next morning. Elena stepped onto her porch to find a neat row of 3 dead starlings, their necks snapped with clinical precision. Later, after a sleepless night, she walked to her car to find the paint shredded. "Stop digging" was gouged into the metal in jagged strokes, the scratches deep enough to reveal the raw steel beneath, a violent warning from someone who knew her routine. The town was no longer a quiet backdrop. It was a living organism trying to expel a virus, and Elena was the virus. Every glance from a neighbor felt like a threat. Every patrol car on the street felt like a predator circling its prey. As she scrubbed the porch, a memory surfaced, a jagged piece of the past she had long suppressed. Sarah, barely 7, crying in the hallway because a shadow man was standing by her window. Their father had walked in, Miller trailing behind him with a beer and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They had laughed, Miller ruffling Sarah's hair while telling her the shadows were just trees dancing. "Big girls don't fear the dark, Sarah," her father had said, his voice cold and commanding. Now, Elena realized the shadow man hadn't been a ghost. He had been a guest. The adults hadn't been protecting her from her imagination. They had been training her to ignore her instincts. Elena studied the last photo once more, magnifying the background. She had always assumed it was the woods, but Marcus pointed out a distinct architectural detail, a rusted iron beam, and a specific pattern of salt-eroded masonry. It wasn't the forest. It was the basement of the old family cannery, a decaying structure on the edge of the cliffs. Her father still held the only set of keys. Breaking into the cannery, she found the air tasted of rot. In a hollowed-out section of a concrete pillar, Elena found a second camera wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the file. It wasn't Sarah. It was a photo of the sheriff and her father arguing over a slumped, lifeless body on the floor, a man whose death was the foundation of their lie. The heavy metal door groaned on its rusted hinges, a sound like a dying animal echoing through the cavernous, salt-crusted cannery. Elena's father stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the pale, indifferent moonlight. He didn't look like a cold-blooded killer. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside by a decade of silence. When he saw the hidden camera in Elena's hand, its screen glowing with the image of his younger self standing over a corpse, he didn't run or deny it. He simply slumped against the doorframe and wept. Between choked, jagged sobs, the truth finally bled out into the night. The Shadow Man had been a prominent local official with predatory appetites who had set his sights on young Sarah. Elena's father had caught him, a moment of protective rage turning into a fatal struggle. He hadn't intended to kill the man, but a single panicked blow had sent him falling against the concrete, ending his life instantly. Sarah had witnessed the horror from the deep shadows. She had been hiding behind a stack of rusted crates, her eyes wide as she watched her father transform into a perpetrator of violent secrets. In her terror, she didn't see a protector. She saw the very darkness she had been warning them about. She had bolted, her small feet pounding against the floor as she fled the cannery. Her father and Miller had chased after her, desperate to explain. But in the pitch-black chaos of the coastal night, Sarah hadn't seen the treacherous edge. She had run blindly toward the jagged cliffs, her final scream lost to the roar of the Atlantic. They found only a small piece of her yellow dress snagged on a briar at the cliff's edge. Miller, ever the pragmatist, convinced her father that the truth would only destroy their family. He had orchestrated the disappearance, using the death as leverage to keep Elena's father under his thumb. "It was supposed to be over, Elena," a voice rasped from the darkness. Sheriff Miller stepped into the light, his service weapon drawn and steady. The silver hawk on his compass seemed to pulse with a predatory metallic gleam. Miller wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking to preserve his silence. He told Elena that she was her mother's daughter, too curious for her own good. He explained that the town needed stability, and the truth was a luxury they simply could not afford. As he leveled the gun at Elena's chest, the air in the cannery turned glacial and still. In that moment, Elena's father looked at his daughter, seeing the light he had extinguished in Sarah. The cowardice that had defined him for 10 long years vanished. With a guttural roar, he lunged at Miller, tackling the larger man just as the first shot hissed through the chamber. He screamed for Elena to run and get to Marcus, his fingers locked around Miller's throat, pinning him against the decaying masonry. Elena didn't hesitate. She scrambled through the debris, the camera pressed tightly to her heart, and burst into the night where Marcus was waiting with the state authorities. The aftermath was a whirlwind of sirens and blue lights. Miller's reign ended in the mud, and Elena's father gave a full, devastating confession. He eventually led them to the secluded cove where the currents had deposited Sarah's remains. The town's long silence was finally broken, shattered by the absolute weight of buried lies. Weeks later, Elena stood at the cliff's edge. The wind whipped her hair, but the air no longer felt heavy with secrets. She placed the last photo, the one showing Sarah's primal terror, at the base of a stone memorial. Beside it, she placed a picture of Sarah laughing. The final revelation offered a strange, enduring peace. Sarah hadn't just been running. She had known the adults wouldn't believe her words. The photo she had triggered on that hidden camera was her final act of defiance, a trail left by a child who knew that even if she didn't survive, her truth eventually would. Elena turned away from the vast sea, walking out of the long shadows and into the bright morning sun.